Okay, great. Well, Teresa, I am so glad to have you here on the show on Just Breathe to share just your vast knowledge. I'm so intrigued. When you reached out to me, it was really perfect timing because I think I had shared with you that I had a client who had just been asking about disordered eating and eating disorders. And so I would love to kind of start right there with you because I think that is something that's a little bit confusing
Mhm.
for those of us who are just kind of learning about it and just having that definition or the differences is a great place to start, and then we can go from there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited actually to be here and talk about some of the things that I see in the eating disorder community and in really all communities, but specifically with adolescents. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm a therapist. I've been working for over 20 years in the eating disorder community. I'm an body positive advocate, and I like to do educational um, opportunities in the world so that people can learn about the differences of exactly an eating disorder versus disordered eating. And if you think of it on a continuum, it's like a spectrum, more of a continuum, I think, because it's all kind of interrelated. Um, Disordered eating is about eating unhealthfully. So maybe that would be binging while watching a TV show, or restricting because the holidays are coming up and we don't want, we want to be able to eat those holiday meals. So we're restricting just to be able to do that, or we're over exercising to accommodate for that. So that can be unhealthy and not necessarily serve our best self and growth. When it evolves to a place where it affects your functionality, your ability to be you in the world, whether it's work, school, family, friends, it becomes more of a disorder. And oftentimes we fuse our sense of self with the eating disorder behaviors. And that's when you're talking about an actual eating disorder. So I'm a big fan that anywhere along that continuum, you can get resources and support, therapy, or programs if it gets to that place. But that's really what you're talking about. So when I refer to eating disorders or disordered eating, to me, they're kind of somewhere along that continuum. And you can, go back and forth on the continuum throughout life if that's part of the challenges for you.
Okay, that's really helpful. So for someone who, let's say, struggles to eat, or struggles to eat in front of other people,
Mhm.
or struggles with food choices and not necessarily based on calories or any kind of nutrient, but just where does that fall, and what would be, kind of advice for that person?
So, when you're thinking in terms of disordered eating on any level, I want you to think about thoughts, the way we see ourselves, the way we think about the food, the way we think about the event, those kinds of things. And then behaviors, restricting, binging, limiting our variety of what we'll eat.
Mhm.
And then the action, like I feel the impulse to exercise because I'm going to go out to dinner with, to a big meal. So I'm going to run 5 extra miles or something like that. Those three elements are what create an eating disorder, and it also creates recovery. So when you're seeing someone doing behaviors, calling them out on that isn't necessarily very helpful. I think we were talking a little earlier, and the term food shaming came up, and it's really like the person is feeling the shame and the guilt because you're saying you're not eating and everyone else is eating, and why aren't you doing that? And not necessarily I'm worried about you, but it could be I'm worried about you, but it's focused on the food and not the person. And so the healing comes from focusing on the person. And the reason I say that is, one of the things that we see in the eating disorder community is a lot of times it happens in adolescence where at least the client identifies that they've been having this struggle. They may have had thoughts previously, but it starts to become part of their sense of self and what they're doing. And the reason is the developmental task in adolescence really is, who am I? Like, I'm going to go hang out with these people and figure out if I fit there. And if I don't fit there, I'm going to go hang out with these people and figure that out. Or both of those groups freak me out. So I'm just going to stay home and not like associate with anybody and get online and just live on the online world. So adolescence has so many complicated layers of figuring out who you are. And if you bring the element of external sense of identity, for example, like you're hanging out in gym class in the locker room, and everybody's talking about, how they're not going to eat lunch because they're going to the dance and they want to look really good and things like that. And you want to be a part of that group. You start to take on those behaviors because you want to be included. And so if you and I both were hanging out in the locker room and we both decided as a collaborative, we're both going to restrict so that we can go to the dance and look really great. And you may do that and not eat, lunch for 3 days and think you look great in your dress. I may do that, but then feel like, oh, I can't eat now when I go to the dance, because if I eat now, my stomach's going to bloat and then I'm going to look fat. And so I'm not going to have the meal there. And then over the weekend, like, oh, well, I got a lot of compliments, so I'm not going to eat this weekend. And then the eating disorder takes on a life of its own. So it's really about your sense of self, your sense of identity. Does that make sense?
It does. Oh my goodness. Yes. And how quickly, that's such a great visual for how quickly that can happen.
Mm-hmm. And people often are predisposed to eating disorders, which is why you and I could have the same conversation and the same feelings, but I developed the eating disorder and you don't. So if you and I are friends, you'd be like, well, what is your problem? Why do you keep doing that? Because obviously you just have to eat and you're fine. But that's not my experience, because now I'm fusing my worth with how I look in that dress, or who's coming to hang out with me, or if I get invited to this party. And so healing from an eating disorder is often about diffusing that, separating the element of who I am versus the eating disorder. We often personify it as Ed, is that an Ed thought, or is that a, Teresa thought? And then you start to create that sense of, well, maybe this isn't who I am. I wonder who I really am. And then you can put the behaviors aside, and then you can start figuring out who you are. So that's a long answer to your question. I'm not sure if I actually answered it.
You absolutely did. And I think that's so kind of just honing in on that last part. I mean, that is complicated for anyone to do, let alone an adolescent, because just thinking about, I mean, if you had that just in a vacuum, let's figure out who you are. Like that's what adolescents are doing, right? Like that's a base layer of like the 100 layers, right? Of things that are going on in adolescence.
Absolutely.
And that is, I mean, that's tough. That's tough without any external, without any, predisposition to anything else, right? So it is easy to see how that can so quickly become intertwined, and how that could easily be like, well, I'm just going to kind of grab onto this because this feels easier. This feels better than trying to figure out who I am in, very organic sense, or just in a, without all these other, because it's kind of a maladaptive one, but it's a coping technique, right?
Well, it is definitely a strategy of figuring out, who you are, because now you have a community and people are concerned about you, but you get compliments initially, let's say, if you're restricting and your body's changing. But when it takes on a life of its own, you lose those relationships because you have to live your life in service of your eating disorder. And it affects your health, obviously, because you're still physically developing in adolescence. So that could be lifelong problems. So that's why when we look at like the behaviors and the thoughts, there are interventions when we get to the eating disorder part of it, of the continuum, where interventions sometimes have to take place without the full commitment of the individual, because they don't see that challenge. They just see that this is working for me. And if you ask me to stop doing these things, I don't know who I am without that. So, and that's a very scary concept. Like, who are we? And that's independent of the world we live in and all the images that the young people are getting exposed to, and the societal norms or expectations, filters on online and things like that. So they live in that world and get images all the time that
Right.
are creating their sense of reality. And in normal adolescence, you're out trying to figure that out anyway. Like, you see somebody that you think is cool and you're mimicking them. And that's just part of figuring out where you are in
Right.
life. But when your algorithms are focused entirely on losing weight, body image, things like that, that's the world that you live in. It's really hard to break free from that until you start to get a sense of, I am not my eating disorder. And so that's a big part of, in my opinion, recovery. Is like, wherever you are in life dealing with this stuff, you got to figure out that this has served me very well at some stage of my life. It no longer serves my authentic self, my higher person. And that's a challenge, I think, for a lot of us in a lot of ways.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. And that whole piece of, if you're able to stay connected to yourself, then
Mhm.
you're able to kind of create that separation. But if you don't really know who you are, and certainly adolescence of all, I mean, like we keep saying, they're figuring out who they are. So that makes it that much harder to stay connected and to not like grab onto something else to be like, well, I'm going to connect to that because that makes me feel good right now in this moment.
Right.
And that's fascinating. I love how you broke that down. And I like the kind of the thoughts, feelings, actions, what you're thinking about, the behaviors, the feelings, right? And then the action, which is something that, formula that you can use in so many different ways. Um,
Well, and it's so much more helpful than you need to eat.
well,
You need to eat. You need to just say, I'm going to sit here until you're done with what you're supposed to eat on your plate. Like, that's not helpful. That's not telling me or helping me understand why I feel so compelled to utilize these behaviors, right? And
right.
parents and loved ones, we often think we know better than the person versus trying to encourage the person for self-discovery. And that can be really a complicated task.
It can be. It can be. And I think so many of us were, you know, our generation really was not brought up to check in with our feelings, right? To check in with who we are and how that connects to everything, right? So eating is very separate from who you are in the world. And in the way that we were kind of I mean, that's very simplified, but just thinking now as we're parents and we have our children, we're thinking, well, you need to eat because that's how you grow. Instead of kind of taking that step back and being like, okay, well, let's look at this from a different angle. Let's
Right.
look at this, you know, from this is, what don't you like? Why are, and maybe these are not good questions, but what about eating? And you can tell me actually as I'm asking these questions if these
Mhm.
are even good questions to ask because they're just coming to me. But why doesn't that seem appealing to you? Or what is there something that sounds better? Or is there because I'm thinking as I'm asking these questions, thinking like you said earlier, we want to take that focus off of the food
Correct.
and put it on the person. So I'm thinking, what are the questions that we could really ask that can, help our child really connect to, like, think about it in a way that's a healthy way to think about it, not, well, I'm just not going to eat it.
So there is there's a great book that we often encourage people that are starting recovery to read.
Mhm.
It's called Life Without Ed, and it's written by Jenny Schaefer. She's an artist, musician, and eating disorder recovery guru. And she wrote it when she was, I don't know, I think she was in her 20s. And she wrote it with her therapist, which was very controversial at the time, but now is, you know, a little bit more okay, I guess. And what she did was she basically shared moments in her recovery where she struggled with her sense of self and what she should or shouldn't do, or how she wants to react to her parents, or how people can support her. And then she would explain how she went through she worked through that. And then her therapist would throw a little bit of his like how he experienced it in. So it's a great book if you're trying to understand how I'm defining that persona, like my sense of self separate from the eating disorder.
Right.
But when she started the book, she starts it, and I think it's the intro, it could be the first chapter, I'm not sure. But she basically writes a letter to her eating disorder, and she talks to him directly, and she says, I'm going to divorce you. And she personified him as an abuser, that he bullies her, he manipulates her, he lies to her, he takes her away from her friends, he takes her away from relationships. He says he's more important than her parents, her loved ones, and that kind of thing. And she believed him. So she followed what he was saying. And her sense of I think it's my declaration to divorce Ed or something like that. But it's the declaration of, I'm no longer going to listen to you. You are no longer in control of me. And that is the first step in getting a sense of, I know I'm doing these behaviors and I'm thinking these thoughts, and maybe they're not actually really helpful, and they're probably bad for me, and maybe they're not serving me the way they did when I started this. But I'm going to start separated from, I'm going to start to break free from that. So I encourage both clients and family members to read that book, because I think it's just really simply written, and it's
Mhm.
written very much in a young person's, young meaning like, you know, teens, 20s, person's voice, that can kind of help you get a sense of what your loved one is going through. So there are specific things you can do at meal times and things like that, but without the foundation of you are not your eating disorder, it's really hard to support that person, because they're not, all they're going to do is hear you telling them to do the opposite of what the voice in their head is telling them. And the voice in their head solved a problem somewhere along the way for them.
Mhm.
So that's kind of like the foundation to build from, if that makes sense. And then you can say, what do you need from me? You know, how can I help you? How can I support you? You know, I'm doing a webinar next week for people in recovery from eating disorders for holiday stress. And we're going to talk about some of those challenges and how we're going to kind of navigate, you know, the holidays, food, family. How do you take care of yourself? There's a lot of perfectionism in the ability to restrict, if that's what you do with your eating disorder. And perfectionism always makes our calendar very, very busy. So
Mhm.
it's about learning how to be in the moment and not in your disorder. And so I think maybe that's a way to approach it, is get a little bit more understanding of what the eating disorder or disordered eating is, and how
Mhm.
it's serving that person to be able to have those dialogues. And once both of you kind of get that, you can be more honest about, you know, what do you need from me? You know, is this helpful? Because sometimes it is helpful for mom to lay out the food on the plate if you're working, let's say, with a therapist and a dietitian. So the therapist, let's say, will work with the thoughts and kind of help you process through that. And then a dietitian helps you understand why a variety of foods is important, why a certain amount of calories is important, where you are physiologically developing, and
Mhm.
why restricting or binging or just manipulating, you know, how you're eating can affect that development. So you're giving that person information they didn't have, to have a better sense of understanding that this coping strategy is going to be more destructive than it was initially.
Mhm.
And I think, you know, if you look at that, it really helps both the family and the person get a better sense of it.
Absolutely. It's a lot of awareness.
It's a lot of awareness, and it's a lot of, I don't know if this is right. This is the way I see it, but it's like narrowing your focus to see where you are before you expand your lens. We can sit here and talk about how culture is perpetuating this, and the diet mentality and the binge purge popular actions in high schools and colleges. They all jump on board and do certain behaviors. There's binge drinking and all kinds of things going on. But that's not going to help Susie, who's trying to figure out how to survive feeling very alone, but being very popular, let's say, or
Right.
or just not feeling like they fit in the world that they're in. And how do I get a sense of who I am when everybody around me is telling me I'm somebody else?
Mhm.
And I think eating disorders, as they get stronger, can leave a sense of emptiness inside. So we don't, when I say to someone, well, who are you without your eating disorder? There is literally like this detachment of like, I don't know what you're talking about. Who would I be without it? Like it's how I engage with the world, it's how I engage with my friends, it's how I control my body. It's all of
Mhm.
those things. I'm like, yes, but if you weren't doing that, think of how much time you might have in your life and what would you do with that time? And
Right.
those ideas are really hard to conceptualize when you're in the throes of it.
Absolutely, they are. I mean,
Mm.
again, kind of circling back to that, that's a tough question for any adolescent, right?
It's a
What,
tough question for some of us grown-ups, I
well,
think.
I was just going to say, it is a tough question for many, many people. I mean, that is if you have to stop and think about it, like you could give like I'm a, I'm a therapist, I'm a podcaster, I'm an author, well, that's like a description of what we do, right?
That's
Like,
right.
who are we? And so that is, which is a much scarier question to answer.
Yeah.
And,
Because what if you're wrong?
right.
What if your thought of who you are is wrong? There's vulnerability in that.
A ton of vulnerability in that.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, again, that's scary for a grown adult. So, just thinking about, as we think about our kids, right? As we're thinking
Mhm.
about this question, holy cow, that is, but I think too, like the gift of this conversation and of this awareness is that we can then pass this on to our kids, creating a very safe space for them to be vulnerable
That's
and to excuse me, to really explore that in a way that y- you know they maybe wouldn't have been able to before, or we weren't able to before, or whatever the case is. um and that can open up conversations for so many different things, right?
so many, so many.
I mean, I'm sitting here thinking as we're talking, I mean, the parallels of um you know supporting a child who has an eating disorder or disordered eating, and supporting a child who is in the process of coming out.
Mm.
It's very similar, right?
Mhm.
I mean, there's on the part of the parent, there's so much the need for awareness and understanding, and it's nothing that you're like, well, you're doing this wrong. It's those are things that we just don't inherently know, right? That's not built into our knowledge base. So this is information that we have to actively seek and understand so that we can be aware, so that we can create this safe space, right?
Right.
And so I'm really, I think these parallels are just, this is kind of fascinating for me. And it also, I think this is a little segue into, you and I were talking about, this is a very common struggle with LGBTQ youth and young adults.
Yes.
Um, and so, I'd love to talk about that a little bit and why, it's almost disproportionately so, and why that might be, and if there are, kind of specific things that, um, either lead to that or that can be done to support?
So the National Eating Disorder Association, NEDA, and the Trevor Foundation, I think it's
Have a
foundation,
project. Yeah.
project, thank you.
Mhm.
Both did studies on eating disorders in the community and found out that 54% of youths within the community from, I think, 13 to 23 is what I'm thinking, somewhere in there, identify as having disordered eating or an eating disorder. And that is astronomically high. And that is vastly different than when we're talking about the diet culture. So, you can say, well, in America, everybody has an eating disorder because we're all hyper-focused on body image and what we're eating and not eating and things like that. But a lot of that is diet culture, and not necessarily my sense of self is related to how I eat and how I see my body or how I see my gender or any of those kinds of things. That's all intertwined with some of the challenges that the youth are going through. So, and another statistic I wrote down because I thought this was fascinating. So I don't remember where this came from because I didn't write it down. Shame on the researcher in me. But 5% of males in the United States identify, I think, as gay, was the statistic I saw. And of that 5%, 42% identify, 40, wait, let me see what I wrote here. Of the eating disorder males that come into treatment, I apologize. Of the eating disorder males that come into treatment, 42% of them identify as gay. So
Wow.
5% of the United States males identify as gay. But within the eating disorder community, the people that seek treatment, which is not always a very high percentage,
Right.
42% of them identify as gay. So they are struggling at such a high level and utilizing this coping strategy, which, again, if we think of it in terms of my sense of self, isn't that a big part of coming out? Like, how do I do that? Is this okay? Will you still love me? Will I have a place? Will I get more bullied? Do I want anyone to know this is happening? Is this just a phase? Am I wrong? So all the questions that you go through can be put on the back burner, let's say, if your health is compromised because you have a full-blown eating disorder. So now we have an identity that we have to address. That's the priority. We don't necessarily have to deal with the other crises or stressors in our life because this takes priority. Then we stabilize the eating disorder and we're back to that sense of who we are. So those parallels, I think, are exasperated because of the challenges of who we are and how, whether it's okay to be who we are, who we see ourselves. And if I see myself this way, what does that mean? Because I'm grown up in a family that doesn't believe any of this is real, or it's a phase, or we're not going to talk about it until you get over it. And so they channel the energy in other coping strategies. So, eating disorders, drugs, withdrawal, internet, all kinds of different things, instead of being resourced into a community that will allow them to explore who they are, that will allow them to try on different hats, which is really a healthy way of going through adolescence, right? We're like, I'm going to be a burnout this week, and do they still say that? And I'm going to be a popular person. I'm going to be a musician, but you try those on to figure out who you are. And if you're not allowed to do that, then you're going to figure out another way of moving through that developmental task.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a little lost because I'm chatty here today, but I think if you think in terms of how can I help my loved one figure out who they are and where they're going to fit in the world, how do I help create that for them? Then you're really addressing the core issue in addition to stabilizing. I'm going to tell you a really quick, completely unrelated story of my own life. So But it kind of overlaps with this. So I adopted my son from Ethiopia when he was 10 months old. And he was very, very sick, very, very malnourished and very sick. So he came here and got all kinds of treatments, but really it was nutrition and antibiotics, but it was a year's worth of them. And then he stabilized and became this, amazing child. And as he grew up, I had a sense that he'd have some challenges because of his early days. There were several times when he almost didn't make it in Ethiopia. He grew up in like a tribal community, so it was very different from where I am. And then as he grew up and went into school, we found out that he falls under the autism spectrum, and he's got, a little bit attention deficit sprinkled in for fun.
Exactly.
Right. So, and I got such interesting reactions from my community. How are you going to do this? I'm a single parent. I adopted him as a single parent. So how are you going to handle this? How are you going to be able to do these things? And I found that so curious, because my initial thought was, well, okay, I'm going to create a world that makes sense to him so he can be the best version of him. I don't know what that world looks like. I have no idea, because I've never been in the special needs community outside of like a therapeutic help a family get resources.
Right.
And so I figure it out as I go. We kind of wing it. Sometimes we're awkward about it, and sometimes we're great. And sometimes we have to set boundaries and do things in different places because it's better for him and us. But I figure that out as I go. So I think it's the same dynamic. You don't get to choose what your children are faced with in life, but you can teach them that there are communities, there's resources. My son is never going to play a sport, but he can do Special Olympics and be a rock star in his community and happy and get all of those things that he needs in the right environment, the right community. But if I don't let him do that, and I just try and make him fit and get through school and use the resources the school gives me, he won't evolve to his best self. He'll evolve to the best he can be within what society tells him he should be.
Right.
So tangents. Okay.
No, not at all. I think that is such a perfect story because, for so many reasons. First of all, bravo. And oh my gosh. And your son is so lucky to have you.
He's amazing.
And just having that, I think a bunch of things that you touched on that are so important, but having that sense of, and I think this is a little bit of like tapping into our intuition instead of like paying attention to what those around us are saying or society is saying, but tapping into our knowledge, right? Like our internal strength and being like, okay, I've got this. We can figure this out. It's going to be messy.
Right.
Because life is. But we can figure this out, right? There's always a solution. There are always choices. And I think one of the most important things for these kids and for us is to know, you brought up the, community several times, that there is community and that we are not alone in this. So, and conversely, if we kind of force into the box that, society likes to have the boxes. So if we force our kids into those boxes, then they are going to feel alone and we are going to feel alone because they are going to struggle because of that. And so it's a whole, like, I just like the kind of the circle there of just tap into your, once again, it goes back to that tapping into yourself, listening to that yourself, your intuition, and following that and being like, I've got this. I can do this.
The therapist in me is coming up with like little terms I want to say as you're talking. Like I want to say, drop the woulda, coulda, shouldas. I would do this. I should do this. I could have done this because they don't serve anyone. They just keep you in your box, right?
Yeah.
And drop the phrase I can't and replace it with I'm resourceful, because I don't know what this challenge is as a parent, let's say with an eating disorder loved one, because it could be anybody in your family.
Right.
I don't really know what that means, but I'm resourceful. So I'm going to help you figure it out, or I'm going to sit with you and go through it. So if, let's say, your challenge is eating a meal, I can sit with you and I can distract you while you get the food in you so you can get past that hump. And then, we can talk about the food later, but at the table, never talk about the food. At the buffet, never talk about the food. If they go to a holiday or a party or a family event, be their ally, be the person that they can go to, give you a look, have some code that they can do. Like, I need to get out, help me.
Yes.
And then just be that person to help them move past the anxiety so that they can continue with whatever the task is. So like let's say the holiday would be the task of going and having fun.
Right.
If I'm so hyper focused on what they're serving, I'm not present. I'm not having fun. I don't know what the heck everybody's been doing since COVID, whether it ended in their world or not, kind of thing. I'm just focused on when the food's coming out and how I'm going to fill my plate to look like I'm eating and those kinds of things. So be the person's ally. Let them go and eat the food that feels safe, because their anxiety of going to this event that's food focused is the bigger picture than whether they had turkey and mashed potatoes and whatever else they're being served.
Right.
So be their ally, create that world and be resourceful.
I love that. I love that. That is, and I have to giggle because two of the phrases I used are literally directly from my therapist, which, you are welcome to this one because it's one of my favorite is don't should on yourself. She's like, don't should on yourself. Right.
Right.
I use it all the time. And then the idea that we have choices, which for me, I was like, oh, I do. Like, I don't have to do that. There are yes, we have there are always choices.
Yeah.
So I love that you said all of that, because I'm like, yeah, that's
absolutely. If you don't acknowledge choices, your world gets really small.
Yes, it does. And scary.
And scary, because anything outside of what you're controlling is dangerous and overwhelming.
Exactly.
But there's also joy and love, connection, community, and all those things outside of that safety, that cocoon that we create around us sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So
very true. Oh my
there's a place in the world for everybody.
Yes, there is. That's why we do what we do, right? Oh my goodness. Well, I have loved having this conversation. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap up? I just know this is going to be incredibly helpful and kind of, mind expanding, mind blowing for people. So,
I have loved having this conversation. I feel like I went off on tangents, so I'm hoping it all comes together for the listener. But if you have any questions, concerns, feel free to reach out to me. I can be contacted at Teresa@teresabussert.com. That's my website. And if you're interested, I'm going to do a holiday webinar, How to Survive the Holidays, Food, Family, and Festivities. And that'll be next week. And maybe we'll do another one further down as we get closer to December. But yeah, I think those things. I also have a guide if anyone's interested. I think you'll share with them as well. It's on binge eating. That was my doctoral project, was binge eating and mindfulness. So we created a little guide to help people with that. But I've loved this conversation, and I just want anything that we talked about that resonates with them, please know you're not alone. There are resources, there are communities out there. I'm going to say really quickly, because I should have intertwined this, but NEDA, National Eating Disorder Association, is a phenomenal resource. ANED is a resource for if you want to look for a local support group. They run support groups. And then there's just several other things that are out there if you're specific to struggling with anorexia, bulimia, binge eating, or any other level of disordered eating. So those things are out there as well. And just remember, it's about thoughts, it's about behaviors, and it's about actions. And what we do when we're in it is serving us or has served us. So we don't villainize it. We just try to recognize that it's no longer serving us, and we want to come back to our sense of self.
That is awesome. There's literally nothing I can add to that other than I am going to link all of this in the show notes. So if any of these things, resonated, please know that this is in the show notes and you will be able to click through right from there. And I'm going to link some of these things on my website as well. So this will be a standing resource, standing resources there. And I know you said next week, but I want to give the actual date because this is going to post next week. So it will be November 16th, correct? Is the date?
16th at 10 a.m. Central Time.
Okay.
And yeah, we can just reach out, we'll send the Zoom link and go from there.
Okay. Yes, I will have that connected, but I just wanted to clarify that because I didn't want just as people are listening to know exactly the date and the time. So
much.
You are very welcome.
Keep doing what you're doing, Heather. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.